And now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today. Professor Peter Fader is a chaired professor of marketing at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. His expertise centers around the analysis of behavioral data to understand and forecast customer shopping and purchasing activities. He works with firms from a wide range of industries such as telecom, financial, gaming, entertainment, retail, and pharmaceuticals. Managerial implications of his work focus on topics such as customer relationship management, lifetime value of the customer, and sales forecasting for new products. Much of his research highlights the consistent but often surprising behavioral patterns that exist across these industries and other seemingly different domains. These insights are reflected in his book entitled Customer Centricity, Focus on the Right Customers for Strategic Advantage. He believes that marketing should not be viewed as a soft discipline, and he frequently works with different companies and industry associations to improve managerial perspectives in this regard. His work has been published in, and he serves on the editorial boards of a number of leading journals in marketing, statistics, and management science. He's won many awards for his teaching and research accomplishments, and in addition to his various roles and responsibilities at Wharton, Pete is also co-founder of Zodiac, software as a service-based company that aims to make top-notch customer evaluation models and insights easily accessible to a broad array of data-driven organizations. In April this year, he was named by Ad Age as one of its inaugural 25 marketing technology trailblazers and was the only academic on the list. Pete?
Wow. Can that be me? You made all that stuff up, Gordon, right? No, I'm so fortunate to have an opportunity to play with data, make it sing and dance, and have all kinds of interesting managerial conclusions arise as a result. I want to thank all of you for taking some time this afternoon or morning, depending where you are. This idea of customer-based corporate valuation, this is the hottest topic that I'm working on today, and I think a lot of people are finding it of great interest and relevance. I hope that you will too. And I absolutely welcome your questions and comments about it as we go on. You know, these are words, it's been kind of a holy grail for marketers, is to understand the impact that our activities have on overall corporate valuation. In some sense, I'm not going to talk about that per se. In other words, I'm not going to talk about the activities per se, but I'm just going to talk about the customers, those upon whom we exert those activities. So if we can look at the value of our customers and add all that stuff up, well, that should be the value of the company. That's all I want to talk about, is doing that simple idea rather simply. But doing it carefully and thoughtfully and being respectful of the differences among customers and the differences within a customer over time. And in doing so, we're going to be able to make all kinds of great statements of what companies are worth and then kind of auxiliary conclusions about what we can do with all that stuff. So let's dive right in. So I mean, here's Corporate Valuation 101. And if you just add up all these various parts, you'll get a firm's total equity. And usually when you look at what firms say about themselves, the two things on the right, the net debt and the non-operating assets, first, those might be relatively small compared to the operating assets. And second, they're usually pretty easy because they're fairly separate to identify them and put a number on them. But where all the action is on the operating assets, all the stuff that we do. And how do we put a number on that, both today and ongoing into the future? That's what really drives overall corporate valuation. And my point is a very simple one, that pretty much every dollar that's going to emerge from those operating assets is going to manifest through the customers. It's going to be someone buying things. So I'm not trying to tease out the customer piece of it. There's a lot of people who will do this kind of thing with branding, like how much of the operating assets can be attributable to the brand. I'm not doing anything like that at all. I'm actually doing something much simpler, saying that for whatever reason, if a dollar shows up from every dollar that's going to show up from our operating assets shows up from a customer, and regardless of the attribution of why we're getting that dollar, let's add those dollars up, project them ahead, again, see how they vary across customers over time. That's going to be overall corporate valuation. like I said, these ideas are not new, and there's a whole bunch of papers floating around, some of which that have this exact same title, customer-based corporate valuation. And some of it's been really interesting, really good work. I don't want to be critical about any of the work that's been done, but I do want to suggest that it's kind of incomplete, or it's not well aligned with what the folks in finance or accounting are willing to do. So, for instance, if you look at this bottom paper here, a very nice paper. I highly recommend it. I teach it in my classes. I think everyone should read it. This idea that customer equity is an integral part of financial reporting. It's a very nice piece, but there is no way that companies are going to be reporting customer equity or building their valuation models around it. Secondly, we need to be really, really careful about how we deal with the data. So I want to kind of take on those two pieces. First of all, how are we going to do the evaluation piece? We're going to do it in the most standard, boring way possible. We are not inventing a new valuation model. This is literally the textbook model from one of the really popular textbooks on corporate valuation that's called Valuation. And if you just look at the blue boxes over here, this literally is Valuation 101. Our point is that we're going to do corporate valuation in a completely standard way, but if we bring in appropriate customer metrics, we can just do a better job of doing the free cash flow projections. That we can just do what it is that the finance people want to do a little bit more accurately, a little bit earlier, and a little bit more diagnostically. So we're going to just play the conventional game, but let's just call attention to the customers in a way that most valuation people don't. And you can see the second red box down here. So we are not making the customer asset values a part of the overall value. It sort of just arises from the side. We're just going to get the free cash flow projections by being mindful of the customer metrics. That's going to give us the overall value of the firm. And oh, by the way, it's going to give us some interesting games that we can play with the customer valuation as well. And I'll show you some of those things at the end of the talk if I have time. So number one, the valuation model, completely standard. We're just trying to bring in data that valuation people tend to ignore. But in terms of the data, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And one of the things that's really bothered me about a lot of past literature is people failing to make the distinction between the two key dimensions that you see over here. So let me elaborate on each one of them. So when we're talking about contractual versus non-contractual, whether there's a contract present or not, the key thing here, as it says, is observable attrition. We know that the customer is going away. They're saying, close my account. I am no longer going to interact with you. Observable attrition is common. You'll see it in some of the sectors shown here, telcos and so on, print and magazine subscriptions. But it's first of all, it's not the dominant mode of business. Most businesses are non-contractual, which we'll talk about next. And also, it's too simple. Because if you think about a contractual setting where not only do you have observable attrition, but people tend to be making fairly steady payments from month to month or period to period, and the size of those payments don't vary that much either. Sure, your cell phone bill might go up or down from one month to another, but we're not talking about an order of magnitude difference. In fact, it rarely would even go up or down by, say, 100%. So contractual is fine, and for some businesses it's the right way to go, but it's not the only business model out there. Non-contractual, on the other hand, is far more common. It's far more insidious because we have latent attrition, and you can see just a partial list of companies just off the top of my head that are involved in a non-contractual setting. And the events themselves show up in kind of clumps, and there'll be a long hiatus between them. And when you spend, there really can be an order of magnitude difference, if not 100x difference between some purchases. I mean, just think about your spending at say, Amazon.com, which, putting Amazon Prime aside, is a classic example of a non-contractual setting. So it's much more difficult. And what's happened in the academic literature is a lot of academics have kind of put their heads in the sand and said, we don't want to deal with that. Well, you have to. And you can't just pretend it's contractual and come up with some phony baloney retention rate, which doesn't make sense in a setting with latent, unobservable attrition. Now, over the years, my various different students and co-authors, in this case, the first author on this work, Dan McCarthy, who just picked up his PhD today, graduation day, here at the University of Pennsylvania, and an auspicious day that it is, because today is May 15th, or as our European friends would say, 15 May, 15.5 if you're a numerical guy, and of course 155 is CLV in Roman numerals. So it's CLV Day, so let's celebrate it by talking about the ways people are calculating and applying CLV. Let's talk about the data structures for a little bit. So it would be wonderful if we had the internal data, if we can actually track when we acquire each customer and what they're doing and so on, and that's great, and most of the work that I've done has looked at internal data. So if you're on the inside and you want to make statements about the value of your customers and how they vary from each other and so on, that's great. And then you can layer on top things like net promoter scores or different kinds of attitudinal or geolocation or biometrics or social activities, whatever. You could put that stuff in the model, but that's generally a bad idea. It hurts the predictions. You're better off using it to profile the CLVs after you get it. So internal data is easy. We're not going to talk about it. It's the external data that in some sense is more interesting. So these would be different kinds of rolled up summaries that are shared by various parties for various different purposes. So it could be first party disclosures. So that would be the kinds of data that companies put out there in their, as you can see here, the reports that they're putting out there to investors, the 10Ks and the 10Qs. Or it could be third-party disclosures. So companies like the ones mentioned over here that will somehow or another get access to granular data from or about a company and roll it up and put it out there either as a syndicated service or just putting it out there in a public setting. We're going to be talking about the first type, which is the kinds of numbers that a company would be revealing about itself. So let's talk about two different examples, one contractual, one non-contractual, of companies using external data, and then us showing how we can take all of that and do incredibly accurate, meaningful, interesting estimates of overall customer and therefore company valuation. Here's the first one. Let me move over to that slide. So we're going to look at, in this paper, you can see the link to it down here. I'll say more about it later on. We look at two publicly traded companies. One of them is Dish Network. The other one is Sirius XM Satellite Radio. And I should point out that these are the first two companies we've looked at. So it's not like we did the following exercise with a zillion different companies and then cherry-picked the ones that work best. These are the first two. So they're both contractual, and in this case, all we're using would be the data that they're making available to their shareholders. So in the case of Dish, this is the data set. This is it. This is the data set we're using. I can share it with all of you because it's all public information. You can see that Dish started business back at the beginning of 1996. At that point, they disclosed to their shareholders how many total customers they had at the end of each quarter. And then a couple of years later, they started adding in this even more refined data, saying how many did we add each period and how many did we lose. And we take this data set, in this case, all the way through the beginning of 2015. That's what we use in our published paper, although I'll give you an exercise a little bit later on where we take the up-to-the-minute data and do some interesting things with it. So what can we do with this data? Well, let's kind of drill down and just imagine, suppose we had the internal data. Suppose instead of being limited by this very crappy, aggregated, rolled up data, suppose we had the internal data. This is the way we think about things. In this case, each one of the columns would be a cohort, and the rows would be the passage of time. So column 1 would be the customers whom we acquired in January of 2016. Column 2 would be the February folks, and so on. So the blue diagonal, that just basically says how many customers did we acquire in each period. So very much like the ads column that I just shared with you on the previous slide. So companies will disclose that. That's great. And it turns out it's actually quite easy to look at the pattern of numbers in the blue box, especially when you do it over several years. And so you can see just a real pattern emerging and fit a fairly simple model to it to say how many more customers will we acquire next quarter and the quarter after that and so on. The red column is the really interesting one. So for any one of these cohorts, how long did they stay with us? In other words, how quickly does that cohort die off? So in this example here, we acquired 1.29 million customers in February 2016, and we're just watching them observably attrite away. So we know how many customers we have from that cohort in each of the subsequent months. Here's the problem. No company is ever going to disclose that. If they did, they were fools. They should never disclose such detailed information. But what is it that companies do disclose? Well, it's the green column over to the right, the total size of the customer base. So what we really want is the red column. But what we get is the green column, which for any one of these numbers just represents the kind of mashup of customers across the customer base from lots of different cohorts, some of whom are newbies and some of whom have been around for a while. So that number isn't quite as informative by itself as the numbers in the red column, but that's all we get. Good news is this. We've spent enough time looking at the internal data from enough companies that we know what the red column pattern tends to look like. We know, again, how these numbers vary across customers and over time. So we kind of know what model we'd run, even if we didn't have access to the red column data. And so if we can make a guess about that pattern for each one of the cohorts and add it all up, well, we get the green numbers. So can we use the green numbers to basically refine our guess to get the right parameters for the dropout of the customers in each cohort? That's what we're doing over here. So it really is, it's less about fancy math, and it's more about just careful housekeeping and being just diligent about bringing in our understanding of customer behavior from other settings. Here is the way that we build the acquisition model. It's the gratuitous Greek stuff that I would lose my academic license if I didn't have in one of the slides. But I just want to emphasize a couple of things here. Number one, this model is so boringly standard that the paper was rejected at the first journal we submitted it. They said, not enough Greek letters. Well, it's not fancy enough. Tell us something new. And our point was, we don't need anything new. That a very, very standard model, kind of model that I've used in many occasions over many years and a lot of other, not only academics, but it's the same model that, say, actuaries will use. It's the same model that folks in manufacturing reliability will use. Just basically looking at a group of things and saying how many of those things will still be with us over time. A completely standard, boring textbook model. One way you might think about it is each person has a coin, heads I stay, tails I go. The coins vary dramatically across people, and to a much lesser extent, they vary over time. Within person, we allow for all that. And the only other thing we allow for, as you can see here, is seasonality and the Great Recession of 2008-2009. Everything else that was going on with DISH over its 20 years of existence, changes in the competitive environment, changes in technologies, acquiring the blockbuster chain, all sorts of stuff. What do we do with all that? We ignore it. We say that's just noise. And a lot of you are now like pushing back at me, or you're hanging up and getting off the webinar because you're saying, that can't be true. How can we ignore all these things? These are disruptive, or whatever words you want to use. And my point is, maybe they are. But from my perspective, when I'm only looking at the aggregate data, they just get lost. The signal-to-noise aspect of them isn't that great. And so if I can just get the fundamental aspects of customers showing up and then leaving, I don't really need to account for those things, and it's actually remarkable how often that's the case. So this is the acquisition process. The retention process is exactly the same. That's the beauty of this model. We use the same exact overall model, and we account for the quarterly changes and so on. There's a few very, very minor, inconsequential distinctions. It's really less about the model and more about the data. You can read about it in the paper. It's not that interesting. But we're running just a very standard textbook model. It's actually the most remarkable thing about it is that no one's done this before because there really is nothing new in terms of the math. It is just the careful housekeeping about watching the customers coming in, going out. And when we fit these models, both to the adds and the drops and to the overall size of the customer base at the end of each quarter, well, here's what you see. The plots look kind of feathery. We have all these lines going off because what we actually did is we didn't just fit the model for the whole data set. We fit it for each and every window of time. So you give us the first few periods, let's fit the model and make some projections for the next few years. And that's what those light dotted lines represent. And we just keep doing that over and over and over, both for the add model, the top panel, and the losses model, the middle panel. And you notice that over time, once we see the customer base basically stabilizing, it's just amazing how, as we get more and more data, how the model doesn't really change at all. And when we take into account the ads and take into account the losses and say how many total customers will there be, that's the bottom panel. And once again, you can see the rolling projections there. And there are some times when they're a little high or a little low, but it really is quite amazing just how much they just hit the mark and how little our understanding of the company has really changed as time has gone by. So when you see these three plots, it gives you a good feeling in the belly that we can really do this. We can really do customer-based corporate valuation. So instead of just doing this projection over, say, a year or two, let's now project it over the next, say, 50 years and then take into account discounting and add all that up and take into account all the internal costs, well, not internal, all the costs that the company shares externally with its shareholders. And that leads us to valuation exercise number 1. So in this paper, we applied this methodology to Dish Network. And as of the end of Q1 2015, you can see that our ability using a very simple model, no tricks, no funny business at all, that we're within 3% of the overall market valuation. Now, you might say that's kind of disappointing, or you might say that's awesome. I hope you say the latter. But it is kind of interesting that using a completely different, non-standard methodology, it's great that maybe people on Wall Street know what they're talking about, or maybe not. So what I want to do in the next slide is to do a comparison of our model versus a bunch of Wall Street analysts. A lot going on in this slide here, so let me explain. We took every quarterly prediction ever made, or that we could at least track down by Wall Street analysts, about 3,500 of them. And you can see this example here. On July 28, 2005, there's some analyst, and she'll probably call up the CEO and say, Charlie Ergen, what's going on? Tell me about your competitors. Tell me about emerging technologies. How's it going with your employees? Tell me, Charlie, tell me everything, because I need to make a forecast over here. And she comes up with a forecast of $2.1 billion of subscriber revenue for Q3, for 2 quarters ahead. We want to compare against that. Problem is, I don't have Charlie Ergen's phone number, and so we have to just use these very simple limited data sets and this very simple model. We come up, and by the way, we can't even do it at that point in time. We have to go back to the latest quarterly filings, which would have been in early May, use the data up to that time, come up with our projection, and of course, I wouldn't show it to you unless ours was closer. But what's really interesting about this is how frequently ours is closer. You can see in the red box that they're not dramatic differences, but if we look at all these forecasts, in most of the time, we're about 10 to 15% closer. So using less data, doing it earlier on, and with no information about what's going on inside the company, we can make better forecasts than the Wall Street analysts. And if you don't believe me, if you think I cooked it up at all, we went out on a limb very recently. So check this out. This is brand new, not even in the paper because it is so new. Here's the data set for all of Dish's quarterly additions right up through the end of 2016, or actually all the way through Q1 of 2017. I gave this data set to my undergraduates and MBA students, some of whom are on the line with us right now, made them model this data set, and made them make forecasts for the next 4 quarters. You can see those over here. There's 159 forecasts from all my students, with the blue line in the middle being the median across them. And how happy am I that just last week, literally just last week, Dish announced its new quarterly numbers. And it turns out, as you can see at the bottom here, our students hit the nail on the head. The Dish announced 547,000 additions. In fact, if you took the median forecast from our undergraduates, it was 547,000. right on the money. These are forecasts that our students made, 2 months ago, but before anything was announced. And we are in the process of comparing them to what the Wall Street analyst said, and I can't really disclose it because we're actually writing up a whole op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal to talk about. All I can say is this: how our undergraduates do better. It's really incredible that with a principled model and just a disciplined use of data, instead of trying to boil the ocean and capture everything, you can do an amazingly good job just by being respectful to our understanding of customer behavior. That's example number one. And if that wasn't cool enough, I think you're going to really like what's coming up here. And in fact, I even have a quiz for you. Now we're moving into the non-contractual world. Okay, so again, we're talking about a world over here when we don't know if the customers have left or not, and we have messy, spotty purchases of greatly varying size. Well, if you are an investor in a non-contractual company, what metrics would you demand from that company? Sort of like adds and drops for a contractual company? What would you demand from a non-contractual company that would let you tell the story in a similar way? If you're interested in seeing the answer to that question, stay here with me. Or if you want, download this paper over here, which actually takes you through the entire analysis. We did this because there are no companies, there are very few non-contractual companies that are disclosing the kinds of metrics that we ask for. We're going to do the empirical analysis for just a division of a privately traded company. So we don't have a market valuation that we can benchmark it against, but maybe that's a good thing. I mean, maybe that's the biggest contribution of this paper or of anything I've ever done to go to companies and to investors or to companies themselves saying, these are the kinds of metrics that should be disclosed. These are the kinds of metrics that really are most informative. So again, we're going to now build the ad model, the spend model, and then the most important model at all, the what are you going to do while you're alive model. How many purchases are you going to make and how long are you going to stay around? Well, the ad model, entirely uninteresting. As you can see here, it is virtually identical to the same model that I showed you before. I don't want to build models that are customized to every different kind of company. I am willing to sacrifice considerable amount in the fit of the model if it gives me some confidence that it's going to give me a better forecast, because that's all I'm interested in over here. And that's why I'm going with the Weibull gamma model that I mentioned before. And now we're going to talk about the repeat purchasing aspects. Any of you who know my work, and I see some familiar names on the list over here, know that I build these models that are popularly called buy till you die. It's like every period I flip a coin. Heads, I stay alive and I consider making another purchase. And if I'm alive, I flip my second coin saying, do I make a purchase or not? That's it. 2 coins. But the coins vary dramatically across people. And in this case, we allow the headsiness of the buy coin to be impacted by seasonality and the recession. So that's it, a very simple buy till you die model. If you're interested in that kind of model, you could see a reference to a popular paper that I wrote. Very, very happy to provide much more information about that. In fact, Gordon mentioned the startup that I have where we've actually taken this kind of model and we're now doing it at full commercial scale. So it's really, really, really easy to do these models, but here's the problem. Suppose we're not inside the company. Suppose we're on the outside and we don't have information about who was buying what when. What do we do then? Before we talk about it, I want to talk about the one other modeling component, which is the spend piece. As I mentioned, spend is much more variable in the non-contractual setting, and so we really need to take into account you could see the fatness of these spend distributions. And so we need to build a full-fledged spend model. We can't just look at average spend and assume that everybody spends the same amount. So we need a second metric that's going to help us flesh out this distribution here in addition to average spend, which basically comes for free in the publicly disclosed statements. So all we're going to ask for, in addition to average spend that we get automatically, would be median spend. Hey, company, just tell us the median basket size for each customer who did anything any month. And it turns out that if you give me the mean and the median, I can flesh out the distributions that I was just referring to. That's good. That's easy. But honestly, that's less interesting than capturing the flow of the purchases over time. So what we need, and here comes the real highlight of the talk, what we need are a bunch of metrics that companies could potentially disclose at a completely aggregated level, both aggregated across customers and aggregated over time. So what we've done, and when I say we, I'm giving myself too much credit, Dan McCarthy has done, is scraped the statements of lots and lots of publicly traded non-contractual companies who have, on some occasions, put some of these metrics out there, and here are the candidates that we come up with. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about them because I'm going to quiz you on them in just a few moments. So these are the kinds of metrics that different companies have put out in their SEC filings that say something about the flow of transactions over time. So number one, tell me about the number of active users. So in this past year, how many customers made at least one transaction with me? And then report that number on a quarterly basis. That's a fairly common metric, and you'll see a couple of slides from now a listing of the companies that do report it. How about the second one? Heavy active users. Tell me the number of customers who have made at least 2 purchases over the trailing year. Okay? And again, I want you to think through these because I'm going to make you vote to tell me which of these metrics are the best ones, the ones you would demand from a company as an investor. Number 3, this one's the closest thing to a quote-unquote retention rate, which again doesn't make sense in a non-contractual setting. But the idea is this. Among all of the people who did make a purchase with us a year ago, what % of them came back and made a purchase within the trailing 12 months? So it's something like a retention rate. And many, many companies will report this metric and sometimes even use those words for it, even though it's not a retention rate. Just because someone didn't buy from Amazon in the last period doesn't mean they're gone, doesn't mean they've churned. So don't call it a retention rate, but this idea of a forward-looking repeat rate. Then we have 2 metrics that are kind of the backwards-looking equivalent of that repeat rate. In this case, we're going to say, of all the orders that were placed in this most recent year, what % of them were by people who made orders previously? Does that make sense? Again, of all of the current purchases, let's say over this past year, how many of them are attributable to people who purchased with us before? That one would be RBPO, repeat buyer proportion as applied to orders. And then the next one would be RBPC. So let's play the same game. Of all the customers who did something with us within this last year, what % of them did something with us sometime in the past? So we can measure this on the basis of the orders, on the basis of the customers themselves. Last, maybe least, maybe not, you tell me, is frequency. So of all those active users who did anything with me in this most recent year, what's the average number of things that they did? So it's the average number of purchases among people who made any purchases at all. Those are the 6 metrics. In case there's anything unclear about them, here's just a nice little make-believe example where you can see these numbers play out. So I hope I don't need to talk through them, but just to take a moment and look them over, and you can see, well, obviously we added 1 customer each period. Well, anyway, you can read them for yourself. The repeat rate is undefined in the first period since the company didn't exist before then. So there you go. There are our candidate metrics, and I hope that you've had a chance to soak them in because, once again, I'm going to ask you to choose 2 of these metrics as the ones that we really want to use in practice. I'll continue talking about them. Here's an example of some of the companies that actually report these things, publicly traded companies that are reporting these metrics to their shareholders. And again, that's why we chose this particular set. All right, folks, it's homework time. Here are the 6 metrics. And we're going to ask these 2 very important questions. How many do we need? And then which metrics do we really want to put at the top of the list? I already hinted just a moment ago about the answer to the first question, the how many question, and that's answered quite well in this picture over here. This basically says the x-axis is how many metrics are being revealed, the y-axis would be what is the predictive accuracy of the model as measured by MAPE, mean absolute percent error. When I'm running these models, I never want an MAPE above 10%. In fact, I'd be unhappy if it's above 5%. And that's usually when I'm building the model off the actual granular data. Well, it turns out here our ability to build that model varies tremendously based on how many metrics we're talking about and which ones. So for instance, if you only gave me one metric, I just can't do it. It just doesn't give me enough to really see what's going on with the flow of transactions. That if I look at the singletons, only one metric gets us anywhere close to 15% MAPE, for forecast accuracy. But if you give me two metrics, if you give me the right two, then if you notice towards the bottom of that column, there are 5 little dots there. There are 5 pairs of metrics that are remarkably good at predicting a future customer purchasing. The other pairs, not so hot. So it turns out that I really don't want to use more than 2 metrics. As I go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to all 6, there's basically no improvement in our forecasting capability. And so, well, why bother? So just notice the overall pattern in that column, in the column with the 2s. There are 5 really good metrics. There are 5 really good pairs, rather. There are 5, pretty good ones, and then there's a few in the middle, and then another 3 that are so high they're off the chart. So the answer is 2 metrics, but which ones? What are the metrics that are overrepresented in that bottom 5? So my friends, it is quiz time. So here is the quiz, and I want you to choose 2 of these metrics, okay? So again, as a reminder, and please do this, click those boxes. And I hope that I don't need to do anything to activate the quiz. Is the quiz activated, Hannah?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So listeners, my 107 people with me right now, click those boxes and tell us which 2 do you think would be the ones that investors should want. Do you want active users, heavy active users, the forward-looking repeat rate, the backward-looking repeat buyer proportion based on orders or based on customers, or do we want frequency? And I'm just so dismayed that only about 50 of you have voted. Here come the votes. Come on, bring them on, bring them on. Let's see what you say. And it looks like the consensus is active users and frequency. And you know what? You're right. Well, it turns out, in fact, I'm wondering how many of you cheated and actually read the paper, because it looks like frequency is, I don't want to say dominant, but far and away the most chosen answer over here. And indeed, let us look at the results. Oh, there's a PowerPoint bill that didn't show up here. I'm so sorry. So let me explain. The big 5, or should I say the little 5, the ones with the lowest MAPE would be frequency plus any one of the other 5 metrics. And the one that's the lowest of the low would indeed be frequency and active users. So that is the best pair, but frequency plus anything else is quite good. And then the next 4, that would be RBPO and anything else. And then RBPC is far and away the worst of the metrics. It's kind of interesting how that repeat buyer proportion metric can be very, very good if we're talking about the actual orders, very, very bad if we're talking about the customers. But the dominant metric is frequency. You give me frequency and anything, even RBPC, and I can make really, really accurate statements about what customers will do over time. In fact, those MAPEs are so astonishingly low that it's basically as good as if you had the raw, granular customer-level data. So that's just a truly amazing emerging insight from this research. Okay, so now we're going to do this for real. Now that we did a lot of simulations to find out that F and AU are the ones that we want, but now let's take a real data set. So this, as I said, this is a division of a private company, but it's a very, very standard e-commerce company. There's just nothing really remarkable about it. The basic models that have been fitting for years and years and years fit the same for them as anyone else. It's just that they were kind enough to give us all of the data since this one division of the company began commercial operations in 2010. We have 5.5 years of data. What we're going to do is to take the first 4.5 years and use that to calibrate our models, and then the last year to see how well we can forecast. And here is the data set. This is it. This is the entire data set. Even though they gave us the granular data, and on some of the analyses we'll actually benchmark against the granular data to show how well we can do with these rolled up metrics. This is all we're going to use for the modeling. So if you look at the first column, that's the number of ads. That's nothing new. That's standard. We've used that before. If you look at the column all the way on the right, quarterly revenue divided by active users will give us average spend per user. So again, we get that for free. And then we bring in median spend. And then there's those other two columns in the middle. You tell me the number of active users, and you tell me the average frequency among those active users. That's it. You give me these 18 numbers over here, and I'm going to back out the whole buy till you die repeat purchasing process, and I'm going to do it remarkably well. Almost, I'm saying remarkably too much, but it's a remarkable day. It's CLV day. So I'm going to show you 6 validation plots now. The first 3 of them, I'm using nothing more than this rolled up aggregated data to see how well our model can track it. And then I'm going to take the results of our model, same model, using nothing more than this data over here, to see how well it can pick up other aspects of the granular data that we don't have the luxury of using to build this kind of model. So first, can we capture and project the number of additions on a quarterly basis? Oh yeah, we can. I mean, sure, there's a little bit of noise from one quarter to another, but if you aggregate it, if you roll it all up on a cumulative basis, you just can't do any better than this. That's great. So what about the number of repeat purchases? So this plot right now tells us the number of new customers, but what about the purchases by the existing customers? And how well do we do there? Really, really well. So if you notice, the curve is rising, rising, rising as we are adding more customers in, but then after quarter 18, we kind of turn off the faucet and we don't let any new customers come in, and we just ask ourselves, how well does this model forecast the repeat purchasing of the ongoing cohort? And you can see them shrinking away, but our model moving along with it very, very nicely. Or we could look at that on a cumulative basis. And again, you can't even see the difference between these two lines. The model is working so well. The next 3 pictures, as I mentioned, are actually, we're going to now benchmark this model based on very limited data against using the actual granular metrics. The simplest thing we could look at would be the histogram. So how many people are making 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 purchases within the calibration period? We don't have visibility into this data to build a model, so you might say it's quite impressive, dare I say remarkable, at our ability to completely nail this histogram, even though we don't have this kind of data available to us. That gives you a really good feeling that the model's working really well. And the next picture is even more difficult. This is actually the toughest test of all. It's also probably the least familiar to you. This is the idea of conditional expectations. We look at what someone has done over the first 18 quarters, and we want to make a prediction about what that person will do based on what they've done in the next 4 quarters. So for instance, if you made 4 purchases within the 18 quarters, what's our best guess of how many purchases you'll make over the next 4 quarters? And if you kind of follow the lines, you'll see the average is about 1. And whether you look at the actual data or the model, we're doing really, really well. So whether you're a heavy purchaser or a light one, it really doesn't matter. That we do just a great job of making these projections at a granular level, which gives you that good feeling that we can now actually use it to make statements about CLV and therefore overall corporate valuation. The last picture and the least interesting one is our ability to capture the spend process. Once again, you give me the mean, you give me the median, I can flesh out this curve over here and make statements about who's spending hundreds of dollars versus ones or tens of dollars, and we seem to be doing a good job of that. So let's talk about corporate valuation. I'll take you through the exercise very quickly. And we don't have a validation to put it up against because this is just a division of a privately traded company. So it might be a little disappointing in that way, but I am very, very confident that if you take the same approach to another non-contractual company, it will work just as well. So here we go. Here are those customer additions. I showed you this picture already, but this showed you how well the model fit over our data set. But we want to now project this out not just over 4 quarters, but for, say, the next 50 years. So let's do that. This is the same exact picture, but with a projection of again, I lost it in the PowerPoint build. But you would see a line that shows you how many projected additions we'd make over the next 50 years. And here's a curve that shows the total number of purchases made by those customers and therefore overall revenue. So it really is a fairly simple process. Once we get our parameters from, we take our metrics, we get our parameters. I didn't really share with you the math of how we do that. If you're interested, read the paper. It's not that interesting. Then it's real easy to project out revenues either at an aggregate level like this or on a customer-by-customer level. And when we take all of those revenues and we take into account the time value of money, what do we get? Well, you're looking at it right here, $22,825,534. Now that precision might be a little bit excessive. 8 significant digits might not be warranted. But the idea of saying that this division is worth a little over $20 million, I absolutely stand by it. And we've bounced this work off of the COO of this company. And he said, that's very much in line with what we think. And we love this tool because it's going to really help us deploy it across our different business units so we can really make apples-to-apples comparisons across them and, of course, apply it to the company as a whole so we can really understand what we're worth. Of course, that's someone on the inside. You can imagine what fun someone on the outside would have with a model like this to be able to drive different kinds of investment decisions. Let me very quickly talk you through some of I mentioned we get interesting marketing insights that just come for free from running a model like this. So for instance, we learn that the expected customer lifetime value when we net out acquisition costs is about, on average, $76. And that's sort of nice to know, except it's also somewhat misleading because the customers vary tremendously. We can also get the distribution of CLVs, and that's what you're looking at right over here. So the mean of this distribution is $76, but there's certainly a lot of variability around it. In fact, it's important to notice that 68% of newly acquired customers would actually be unprofitable. But then you could see this very, very, very long tail. There are some people who really will go through the gates of hell to stay with this company. And so that's the distribution of value for newly acquired customers. And I think, again, it's great that we can get this using nothing more than rolled up aggregated data. I think these are insights that even people inside the company with all of the granular data probably couldn't produce as effectively as what we're able to do with this model. Last little exercise over here. Then it's time for shameless boasting, and then time for any questions that you might have. So we can also make statements about how the value from our existing customers will kind of die out over time. So as we stand at the end of our data period, we can say that our existing customers, forgetting about new additions, have a net present value of about $3.1 million. You can see here about 15% of overall corporate valuation. Isn't that a cool thing to know, or at least to be able to estimate? That we have the value of the company. What percent of the company's overall value can be attributed to the customers that we have with us today? And it would be great to be able to benchmark that across lots of different companies or divisions. But now let's put it into motion and to say, okay, that's 100% of our value today, but how much of our future value will be related to the future customers? Oops. Oh, once again, my bad. We had a cool PowerPoint build, and you can see the words over here, that over the next 3 years, only 25% of our revenue would be expected to arise from customers who are alive today. So even though we have this nice, healthy customer base, they are dying off. It is amazing how that happens. And it's cool to be able to get this kind of insight from such a very simple, limited model. So here's the summary, and then it's shameless boasting time. Using data the right way, as opposed to some kind of kitchen sink, big data, machine learning sort of thing that's just not as principled, that is not resting upon the decades of work that has told us what the patterns are using very simple data structures. If we take advantage of those stories, we can do just a great job of saying what customers and therefore a company is going to be worth. Let me emphasize once again, contractual and non-contractual are wildly different. Non-contractual is much more complex, but if you're in a non-contractual setting, you just have to bite the bullet and learn this stuff. So we fit these models, and of course we recommend that you use the right kinds of metrics if you're in the non-contractual space. Shameless boast number one. On SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, where quant marketers tend to put their papers out there for kind of public downloading, these two papers have featured quite prominently. That the contractual paper is the second most downloaded paper ever on the marketing channel of SSRN, and it's quickly catching up to that number one paper, which is considerably older. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this will be the first paper to ever be downloaded 10,000 times on SSRN. And the second paper, the non-contractual one, it has just aged itself off of this 60-day list. It just came off it last week. But just before then, you could see that it was far and away the most downloaded current paper, downloads that actually are greater than all of the other top 10 papers combined. There are a lot of people reading these papers, and it makes you think it's not just marketers. And indeed, that's the case. And on this next slide, I could say this might be just a real career-capping achievement. The fact that our paper on non-contractual customer-based corporate valuation was also number one for weeks and weeks on the corporate valuation channel. So a bunch of finance people are reading this paper too, and what more can a marketing professor ask for? So that is my story. If any of you are interested in pursuing it further, we have a few minutes for questions right now, but I would be just delighted. I would be honored if you hit me with an email, and happy to pick it up that way. If you're interested in other conversations like these, other applications of these models and so on, follow me on Twitter. And I gave the brief shout out to this company, Zodiac, where we've commercialized these models and trying to get companies to really think broadly about these kinds of metrics, including this idea of customer-based corporate valuation. I actually really recommend you to go to that website. I'm not trolling for business here, but there's a lot of great content on the site. So it's given me a good excuse to blog a lot more. So there's a lot of really fun blog posts there, just different perspectives on customer centricity and customer-based corporate valuation. And then finally, once again, there are the links to the two papers. Download them, read them. Let me know if you have any questions about them. 5 minutes to go. Let's get some questions. So I see one from Brett over here. How does this interact with a Fader-Hardy model? Well, so I appreciate the question. I'm glad that you are familiar with the Fader-Hardy models, and that is exactly what we're doing, is we're just figuring out how to estimate a Fader-Hardy model, but instead of having, that is a buy-to-you-die repeat purchasing model, but instead of having the internal granular data, just using rolled-up metrics to let us approximate it. And as I said, if you give me the right kinds of metrics, then I can get results and forecasts and insights that are basically just as good as if I ran one of the traditional buy-to-you-die Fader-Hardy models on top of using the granular data. Steve Cohen's asking a question about the log normal versus the gamma distribution for spend. Turns out it really doesn't matter. It's really hard to tell apart a log normal from a gamma. They both will have that long tail there. I go back and forth between them interchangeably. I'll sometimes go with the gamma because it's a little bit simpler to estimate. But if I want to bring in different covariates, like in this case to bring in quarterly dummies and the recession, the log normal lends itself to to the covariates just a little bit better. But it really, really doesn't make any difference. Let's see what other questions that we have here. Ryan asked a question. How would the model adjust if a retailer has such a large average price change, a price point, that repeat purchases are more like every 7 to 10 years, like a mattress? Well, it turns out that these buy-to-you-die models are just as robust in a frequent setting, let's say mobile gaming, where we're talking about a daily cadence, versus, say, mattress purchasing. I just bought one last night myself, so I'm out of that market now. It turns out that the patterns look identical, but the time axis is obviously going to be different. And so in the infrequently purchased setting, all the more reason why you can't really trust the granular data that much. You're not getting much of it. So what could we do with the rolled up data to help us get some visibility into it? So I'll be the first to acknowledge that you're just not going to see the diversity of customers quite as quickly. But if you have maybe a little bit more patience, or if you have a large enough customer base where even though each one is moving kind of slowly, when we aggregate them all together, we can get the right quarterly metrics. It should be totally fine. Someone asked about B2B. I'm going to give the same exact answer. I apply these models quite routinely in different kinds of B2B settings, whether it's great big ticket B2Bs where people are buying capital equipment, or it could be in an industrial distribution setting. So a lot of the companies that we're working with at Zodiac are B2B, and it's just amazing when you have well-defined decision-making entities making decisions over time. I don't care whether it's a product or service, B2B, B2C, fast or slow. It's the right starting point to work with. I think I skipped past some questions. Oh, my goodness.
Well, they were about B2B, so I think you covered those.
Good. And then Steve Cohn asked about clumpiness. So some of the more advanced work, the newer, really interesting work on some of these buy-to-die repeat purchasing models, try to enrich the behavioral story. The idea that maybe people are buying in a much more clumpy manner than the kind of the more random process specified in the original versions of the models. The problem with that is we would then need, if we only have the rolled up data, we need another metric that could pick up some aspect of that clumpiness. So we might have to demand a third metric out of the company, and if we got the right one, then I bet we could play that game as well. But you know what? Let's walk before we can run. I don't know if we have time for any more, or if we kind of have to go.
Maybe one more. There's one there about, yeah.
So a question here, can this prediction be used for a company to project its product portfolio changing over time? It's interesting. In the case of Dish Network, they were very much changing their product portfolio over time, and we ignored that. So at a very aggregate level, as long as those product additions and deletions are happening on a regular basis and aren't necessarily transformative, you should be able to capture that stuff pretty well, or you should be able to do it for each different product area separately. Well, with that, again, you have my contact information here. I hope that you have found this conversation to be worthwhile. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to celebrate CLV Day with all of you in such a manner. I want to thank the folks at MSI for setting it all up, and I want to turn things back to Gordon Hanna to wrap it up.
Thanks very much, Pete. That was great. Everybody's got all the contact information. They can follow up with Pete later. Let me just mention, because we are at closing time, that our next webinar will be held on May 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and it'll feature Paul Fombell from Northeastern University. Again, thanks a lot, Pete, for doing this. Thanks for everybody in the audience, and look forward to our next webinar with you. Thanks.
Happy CLV Day.
Happy day.